Hi, my name is Dale O'Neill. I'm an attorney, and today I want to talk to you about the evidence of Jesus, and specifically the evidence of his resurrection. I'm not a graduate of the seminary. I'm not a pastor of a church. I'm simply a lawyer. And as I read the Bible and read the New Testament, I ask myself, could I prove these things in this Bible today in a modern courtroom? Well, today I want to look at the resurrection of Jesus, and I want to see what sort of evidentiary proof there is that we could present to a judge and jury about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And today I'm going to ask you to be the judge and the jury. Just listen to this evidence, and then you decide whether or not Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected. And I really mean you decide, because that decision you make affects your eternal life. Jesus said, "No one comes to the Father but through me." So let's look at the evidence together. Because you've got to believe this to have eternal salvation. And to put this in perspective, today in the world we live in, over 1.5 billion people expressly deny the crucifixion of Jesus, and they deny the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I personally believe that both the crucifixion happened and the resurrection happened. And so let's walk through the actual evidence, the courtroom evidence that we have today that we could present. Well, to have a resurrection, you have to begin with a person, and that person must die. And then you may have a resurrection. Well, there's no doubt that there was a person named Jesus. Even the atheists living today believe that there was a man named Jesus. They believe that he was born around a certain time, he lived for a certain period of time, and they believe he died around a certain period of time. In fact, we have today writings that were written over 2,000 years ago about Jesus. Even 2,000 years ago, there were professional historians. They weren't Christians. They weren't necessarily Jewish. They were historians. They had it upon their heart, and their motivation was to accurately preserve history. And their writings contain specific references to Jesus. The most famous historian of that time was a man named Josephus. Now, Josephus was Jewish, but he was not Christian. He wrote a book called The History of the Jews. You can still get copies of it today on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. There's no doubt about that book. There's no doubt about who the author of that book is. And there are specific references to Jesus. That's proof that Jesus lived and existed. Another historian of that same date, that same era, that same vintage, was a man named Thallus. Now, Thallus was anti-Christian. Now, he voted to persecute the Christians. He did not believe in the message of Jesus. And that's very important because Thallus, in his own writings, a man who was antagonistic to Jesus, admitted that he existed. And as a trial lawyer, we call that an adverse witness. You know, a man that it would have been much easier for Thallus to simply deny the existence of Jesus. It would have been much easier for Thallus to never mention Jesus, to be silent on him. But even Thallus, who persecuted Christians, admitted to the existence of Jesus. And that's pretty compelling proof. And then, of course, the third source of information is this entire thing we call the New Testament. The New Testament was written within a generation of the passing of Jesus, and it was authored by men who saw Jesus, who touched Jesus, who dined with Jesus, who followed Jesus, who walked down dusty trails with Jesus. So there is no doubt about the historical existence of Jesus. Even atheists believe he existed. Jesus is the most studied man in human history. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies of the Old Testament. So we've got a man that existed. To have a resurrection, we've got to have a death. What proof do we have of the actual death of Jesus? Well, history says that Jesus was crucified on a cross. All of us have seen crosses. There's so many people that have a bracelet with a cross on there, or a necklace with a cross. The crucifixion 2,000 years ago was the Roman way to kill someone that the Roman government wanted killed. Typically, it was a criminal, it was public, and it was horrible. It was ultimately, well, it was the ultimate humiliation, and it was the ultimate public display of the Roman power, the power they could flex against anyone who stood up to Rome. The death of Jesus is an absolute certainty. When the Roman government decided that they were going to crucify Jesus on a cross, they began by flogging him. They flogged him with an ancient device called a scourge. And I may not pronounce that right, scourge. A scourge is a set of ropes that have tendrils. And at the end of each tendril, there are bits of metal or bones tied into the tips. And when the Roman centurions would beat a man with a scourge, each one of those bits of metal or bits of bone would dig in to the meat, to the flesh of the person that they were flogging. And when they pulled that scourge out, bits of metal was torn out from that man's flesh. They flogged Jesus 39 times with that scourge, and 39 times bits of flesh were ripped out from his body. They put a crown of thorns on his head, large thorns that dug into the scalp and the forehead. So after he'd been beaten and his body torn up, pulled apart, they put him on a cross. They nailed him to a cross with hammer and nails, just like a carpenter would hammer something together. They put nails through his hands and put nails through his feet. And then they hung him up there in public. He hung up there until he died. We have a modern word now called excruciating. The root of that word is crucifixion. The crucifixion that Jesus went through was excruciating. There is no doubt that Jesus died, and just to make sure, after being flogged, his flesh torn out, and hung up on a cross with nails in your hands and in your feet, the Roman soldiers ran a spear up through his side, all the way up to his heart. They confirmed he was dead. When they knew for sure he was dead, they took the body down from the cross and prepared the body for burial. There was a man named Joseph of Arimathea. He personally saw that Jesus was dead, and he went to the Roman government and asked for the dead body. Records show that Joseph of Arimathea was given that dead body. Records in history further show that over 75 pounds of spices and mint were applied to a dead body. Records show that this dead body was wrapped in linen in a particular manner, with a face cloth put on there in a particular method. There were a number of witnesses to this death, to this dead body, including a rich man named Joseph of Arimathea, which I've already alluded to. That body was placed in a tomb. That tomb was owned by this same Joseph of Arimathea. And that's important because this rich man of renown, a man of standing in the community, a Jewish man, a Jewish leader, everybody would know that they could go to this man. They could identify Joseph of Arimathea. That's really the man who was willing to say, I saw the dead body. That's really the man who said, I owned the tomb that the body was placed in. That's really the man that could identify that specific tomb that that specific body was placed in. And that's really the man that could identify that, yes, he was wrapped in linen and 75 pounds of mint and spices. There is no doubt about the evidence of the death of Jesus. There is no doubt as a lawyer as to the eyewitness who could testify in the middle of a courtroom. Then the Roman guards, as ordered by the Roman government, rolled a 2-ton rock in the opening of that tomb. 2 tons were rolled in there. And that's so that somebody like me or you couldn't individually go down there, open a tomb, and steal that body. A 2-ton rock was put in there. But more than that, they put a Roman seal. The seal of the Roman emperor was placed on that tomb, on that rock. And anybody that broke that Roman seal would be put to death. Well, no one's going to open that tomb up and steal somebody. Then they put a set of Roman guards out front. So anybody who had the thought of, hey, let's steal this body so there could be a doubt as to the ultimate resurrection, would have to break the Roman seal, risk death, and that's only if they could get through a set of Roman guards who allowed them to get to the tomb, which I don't think is ever going to happen. We have the most documented death in all of human history. Jesus lived and died. We've got proof of his life in the historians. We've got proof of his death and the eyewitnesses that are named specifically by name. The tomb was identified at that time. Well, if we've got a life and we've got a death, then we can have a resurrection. And that's our purpose today. Can we prove the resurrection of Jesus? Well, let's talk about the proof of the resurrection of Jesus. The first bit of proof we've got is an empty tomb. The Bible teaches us, and history teaches us, that the first person to go to the tomb was a woman. And you may think, well, what difference does that make? Man or woman, black or white, what difference does that make? Well, in the time of Jesus, and this is from a lawyer's perspective, the time of Jesus' life, a woman could not legally testify in a courtroom. And if the very first witness is a legal term. That's someone who testifies. They're a witness. They're a witness to an event. If the very first witness is a woman, that means that that person could not testify. Well, if you were the writer of this history, if you were the writer of the New Testament and you were fabricating this story, you wouldn't use as a witness somebody who couldn't even testify, because that would degrade the testimony. That would degrade your case. You could not prove your case in the middle of a courtroom. It was more important to them to tell the truth. It was more important to them to be accurate in the history and the truth of this resurrection than it was to tell a good story. And so therefore, they hurt their own case, but they told the truth. The very first witness was a woman. The next bit of evidence we have is all of the witnesses who saw Jesus walking, talking, breathing, eating after his crucifixion. Now, as a lawyer, I read these testimonies, and I read this evidence, and I read the statements of the witnesses that are recorded in the New Testament. And the one most compelling to me as a lawyer, who's been in the courtroom, who's cross-examined a witness, the most compelling testimony I have, the most compelling witness, is that of Paul. Paul said that over 500 people at one time saw the resurrected Jesus. But he doesn't stop there. He says, many of whom are still alive. As a lawyer, that means there are 500 people, or at least those that were still alive at the time, who you could cross-examine. You know, Paul lived in a dusty little town. You could walk down a dusty little road and talk to these survivors of this 500 and cross-examine them. You could get this person's story, you could get that person's story, this person's story, and compare these stories. Paul said, wait, I'm here to testify about the resurrection, but if you don't believe me, there were over 500 people that saw him at one time, many who were still alive, many who could still be cross-examined, many who you could compare their stories to. And as a lawyer, that's compelling evidence. The next evidence we have is the changed lives of each of these disciples. These disciples were chosen by Jesus for reasons that we'll never truly understand, at least not in this lifetime. But most of these disciples were simple people. They didn't have formal education. In fact, the majority of them were fishermen. Jesus would see them on a boat. Jesus would see them at the side of the lake and follow me. These disciples had never really accomplished much in their life until they became disciples of Jesus. These disciples saw the crucifixion of Jesus, and these simple men scattered. They were afraid. They were afraid of the Roman government. One of the missions of the Roman government was simply to perpetuate Rome. Rome would put down anybody who threatened the Roman way of life. And these disciples, when they saw the crucifixion and they believed that Jesus was dead, scattered. They were afraid. They were afraid of Rome. And I would have been too. It was the most powerful government in the history of mankind up to that time. Well, these disciples began seeing the resurrected Jesus. In fact, the New Testament talks about 14 different times that Jesus appeared to different disciples at different times and in different groups. Sometimes it'd be one disciple, sometimes a group of disciples. But these disciples eventually saw the resurrected Jesus. These disciples who were simple fishermen, these disciples who scattered at his death, saw him. And apparently they believed in the resurrection because each of their lives were forever changed. These guys went from being simple fishermen, uneducated, to spreading the news of the resurrection to the world. They went into different areas of the world at that time, and each of them told the same story that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. Let's take just a minute and talk about each of these disciples. These disciples went out and talked about the resurrection in an environment where anything of that nature was put down by the Jewish religion. Anything that contradicted Judaism was put down. Peter. Let's begin with Peter. Peter was kind of a rough guy. He was impetuous. He was a fisherman. He had calluses on his hands. And of course, he was one of the first ones to leave when Jesus was crucified. He was scared. He fled. Maybe you remember the story. Jesus told him, before the cock crows 3 times, you will deny me. Peter says, I'll never deny you. Jesus was crucified. Peter denied him. But then Peter saw the resurrected Jesus. And Peter, this fisherman from some small little community, became a fearless spokesman and went throughout the world talking about Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection. At that period of time, Nero was the emperor. Nero hated Christians. Nero was king. Nero did not want anybody else to have the title of king except Nero. If Jesus was resurrected, he could be, in Nero's fear, in Nero's eyes, a king. Nero gave a proclamation to kill and persecute every Christian who testified, who witnessed about Jesus, about his resurrection. They found Peter. Peter was put into a prison. He was put into a prison simply because he was a Christian and was testifying. He was a witness. I'm a lawyer. He was testifying. He was a witness as to the resurrection of Jesus. He was put into a famous prison, a very unique prison. The name of this prison was Mamertine. Mamertine was unique throughout the world in that it was carved into a solid piece of rock. There was a wall, a side of a cliff, and they carved this prison into this wall. Mamertine had 2 cells, an upper cell to hold a prisoner, a lower cell to hold a prisoner. The upper cell was unique in that there was a slit across the top so that the sun could occasionally come in. There was a slit in the bottom so that the human excrement could fall through. And it would fall through to the lower cell. The lower cell had one slit. It was the one on top that the human excrement fell through. The lower cell had a post in the middle beneath that slit. Nero ordered that Peter be tied to a post beneath that upper slit. He couldn't move. He could not escape what came through that slit. He could not see the sunlight. And he stayed there. Nero told him, all you have to do is deny Jesus, deny the resurrection, and we'll let you go. We'll get you out of this cell. We'll get you out from under that slit. Peter, who had seen the resurrected Jesus, said, no, I've seen the resurrected Jesus. I'll stay here. One day when Nero had had enough, he sent his men to go get Peter out of that prison, out of that lower cell, untied him from that post that was in the middle. Nero called him into his personal presence and said, I'll give you one more chance. All you have to do is renounce, deny the resurrection of Jesus, and you'll be free to go. Peter, a simple fisherman, did not. He told the most powerful man in the world, no, there is a resurrection. I saw it. And since Peter would not do what Nero said, Nero ordered him killed. Nero said, crucify this man. And Peter, a fisherman, told the most powerful man in the world, I'm not worthy, I'm not fit to be crucified the same way Jesus was. If you're going to crucify me upside down, because I'm not fit to be crucified in any other way. Nero said, fine, crucify him upside down. Peter died. Peter died. Peter stayed in a prison rather than deny the resurrection. The next disciple we can talk about is Andrew. Andrew went out testifying that he had seen, he was a witness, he had the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus. He had seen the resurrected Jesus. The people in power at that time told him to stop, told him to recant, and he did not. They ordered him to be nailed to a cross and stripped naked. He hung there for 2 days until he died. He hung up there in the sun. He hung up there with people beneath him laughing at him. All he had to do was deny the resurrection, and they would have brought him down. He hung there for 2 days and died because he had seen the resurrected Jesus. The next disciple is Thomas. We have this phrase today, doubting Thomas. You're a doubting Thomas. Thomas originally was told that Jesus was resurrected, that he had come up out of the grave and was living. Thomas didn't see it and told the people telling him that story, told the other disciples, I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when I can touch him. He doubted the resurrection. Later, Jesus appeared to Thomas. Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, told him, put your fingers here where that sword had gone up into me. Put your fingers here where the nails went through my hand. And Thomas did. And Thomas believed in the resurrected Jesus. He felt it. He had evidence. He touched it. He could see it. He had everything any witness could ever have in the middle of a courtroom. Touch, feel, smell. He went out and told the world that he had seen the resurrected Jesus. Well, Thomas was killed for believing in Jesus. Thomas was in deep prayer one day to the living God, praying through Jesus, and the Hindus who did not believe in Jesus saw him, and they ran a spear through him, and he died as he worshiped. All he had to do was deny Jesus, and he would have lived. The next disciple is Matthew. Matthew was condemned by the Jewish Sanhedrin for telling people about the resurrection of Jesus. Because he testified, because he had evidence, because he was a witness to the resurrected Jesus, he was taken in, he was tackled, he was pinned to the ground, and his head was cut off. He died that way rather than deny he had seen evidence of the resurrected Jesus. The next disciple we have is Philip. Philip was killed at the age of 87. Pagan priests crucified him upside down because he was testifying, giving evidence, he was a witness for the resurrection of Jesus. He was tied and nailed naked to the cross, but he was nailed uniquely. He was upside down, but rather than drive the nails through his hands and through his feet, they drove long pegs of wood through his thighs, and he hung upside down until he died. He hung upside down, publicly, naked, stakes, pegs driven through his thighs, rather than deny the resurrection of Jesus. As he died, he prayed for his enemies, just like Jesus did. The next disciple we have is Bartholomew. The pagan priests arrested him, beat him, and crucified him. The next disciple we have who testified about the resurrection was Jude. Jude was martyred when a barrage of arrows came down from Mount Ararat. He had been chased and persecuted because he testified about the resurrection of Jesus. The next disciple we can talk about is James. Now, there were two James, at least two, in the New Testament. I'm going to talk to you right now about James the Lesser. James the Lesser was a witness to the resurrection and the resurrected Jesus. James went out and told people. He was a witness. He had evidence. He testified. James the Lesser was stoned to death in Jerusalem because he testified that he had seen the resurrected Jesus. Next is Simon the Zealot. Of course, zealot was a Jewish person who was a zealot for the Jewish law. Simon was told to quit testifying about the resurrection of Jesus. Simon refused. He said he couldn't. He had seen the resurrected Jesus. Well, here's how he died. His body was sawn in half with a saw. They took his body, held it down, got a saw, and cut his body in half as he was alive. He could have stopped that saw at any moment just by saying, okay, there was no resurrection. He didn't. He believed in the resurrection. He saw the resurrected Jesus. He sat there and watched as his body was cut in half. He died by choice because he was not going to deny the resurrection of Jesus. Now you think about all these disciples, how they died, why they died. Could there be any doubt in your mind? You're the judge. You're the jury. Is there any doubt in your mind that these men, these simple fishermen, saw the resurrected Jesus? They died because they knew they had seen the resurrected Jesus. They died because they were witnesses. They died because they gave testimony. A simple man, persecuted and chased by the most powerful government in history at that time, all they had to do was deny the resurrection. They died. Now, what kind of evidence would that be from a witness stand? There's no doubt. They believed they saw the resurrected Jesus. So we've got the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, the evidence, the testimony of witnesses of Jesus. As a lawyer, if I were to envision all of that being presented from the witness stand in a courtroom today, that you are the judge or you are the jury, there'd be no doubt in my mind. I believe that Jesus lived, that he was crucified, he was buried, and he arose again. He was resurrected. There's no doubt in my mind as a lawyer, there's no doubt in my mind that Jesus came up out of the grave. There's no doubt in my mind about the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is the only religious leader in the history of mankind to have been resurrected from the grave. Jesus is the only religious leader to predict his own death, how he would die. Jesus is the only religious leader to predict his resurrection, up to the number of days and nights that would pass between his death and his resurrection. Jesus is the only religious leader in my mind. There is no other man that's been resurrected from the grave. And we need to understand the importance of the resurrection. The resurrection, actually the crucifixion and the resurrection, were accurately predicted accurately prophesied thousands of years before any of this actually occurred on the earth. Thousands of years before Jesus was born, there was prophecies about when he would be born, where he would be born, where he would live, how he would die, and how he would be resurrected. His resurrection is proof that there's life after death. And I've got to ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if there's life after death, what does all this mean to you? Jesus said, I am the way, that no one comes to the Father but through me. Well, if this man is so unique, if this man has people dying as they witness and testify about it, if this man is listed and written about by the greatest historians in the history of man, I'm inclined, as a member of the jury sitting beside you, to believe all these things. And if we believe all these things, if we believe in the birth of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, then we have to understand He is our Lord. And so today, I want you to take a few minutes with me and reflect. You've heard the evidence. Was He resurrected? I think so. I love you.